Lesson 130, Didomi. Catherine, this lesson is a special one because we're starting to explore a new kind of verb, which we call a me verb. And so our new word for this lesson is a me verb. That's the verb didomi, and it means I give or I am giving. And so this kind of verb is special because the first person singular form of it does not end with an omega. Instead, it ends with me. That's mu and iota.
Yeah, and so the class of me verbs will have different endings than what are called omega class verbs, which are the ones that the readers have been learning so far, except for a me. A me is technically a me verb, even though it has slightly different endings than didomi.
So our new verb for this lesson is really it's performing two functions. It's sort of doing two things. One, it's going to help us build sentences that have an indirect object. And then the other thing it's doing is it's introducing us to me verbs in general. So it's kind of doing two things. And the way I've structured the lessons here, the way I've plotted out the lessons, we're going to be exploring first the fact that didomi can help us make sentences with indirect objects. We're going to do that first. Then after we get a grip on that, we're going to look more at just the me verb in a general sense. Of course, if we tried to do all that all at once, it might be a little bit too much to do.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to delay the me verb exploration for later. And right now we're going to look at the dative case and indirect objects. But unless we have a verb like didomi, we can't really make sentences that have an indirect object. So having this verb here right now is really kind of utilitarian. I just needed it to make sentences. So
Right. And in order for indirect objects to work, because you need the party in the sentence that is benefiting or receiving, we need a verb that shows the benefit or shows someone receiving and sets up that structure. And didomi is a great one because it's very clear who's the direct object or what is the direct object and who is the indirect object or what is the indirect object. So it's a very clear illustration of how indirect objects work when you make sentences with didomi.
And before we go any further, let's talk a little bit about the pronunciation of this verb. The accent is on the first syllable, and in this book, we are pronouncing the letter iota like E all the time, whether it's a long iota or a short iota. We're pronouncing it like E, just with different durations.
Right.
And then in the second syllable, we have an omega, which is a long O sound. So it's going to sound something like didomi. Give a little extra length to that omega there.
And this is a great verb just to remind our listeners that in English, because we don't have the duration type of thing that Greek has, we want to put the stress on the long syllables. But this word is kind of like iatros in that the accent is on a different syllable than the long vowel. So the long vowel omega, we have to hold it out for longer, but it's not the accented vowel. That first iota is the accented vowel. And so we need to put the stress on the D, but we still need to lengthen the O. So
we have to treat accent and vowel length as two separate things, and we have to apply them differently to different syllables.
Yes.
Unlike in English, like say with the word potato, the second syllable is long and it's accented. So potato, it makes it easy to do both to the same syllable. We lengthen it and accent it. But in Greek, sometimes you have to apply accent and lengthening to two different syllables.
Right.
And that's why I think I encourage students of Greek to practice vowel length right from the very beginning and not to delay that until later.
Right. And that's one of the Again, we keep harping on doing things early, but this is why. It does eliminate a lot of work later on.
And it's a thing you can physically practice. I mean, it's saying things is a thing that you can, you actually do it with your mouth. So it's a physical thing you can practice. Dido me. Dido me. If you do that over and over, you can get accustomed to not only the sound of it, but actually moving your mouth to make those sounds.
Right. And so your mouth will get used to it and it will feel natural after a while.
And that's benefit number 4,529 of speaking ancient Greek, treating it as a spoken language.
Exactly.
It's just one of the many, many, many benefits you get out of speaking it is you can interact with those pronunciations in an experiential kind of way, which is extremely helpful for the student.
Yes.
So now that we have didomi, our Greek verb that means I give or I am giving, let's start to use it in some sentences. So here in this lesson, we have lots of example sentences where we are building sentences that have a subject, a direct object, and an indirect object. And so our first one here says, I am giving the horse to the farmer. And so our verb here is didomi. That's our new word for this lesson. So that says I give or I am giving. And then we have ton hipon. That means the horse. Notice that it's in the accusative case. And then we have an indirect object in the dative case. Notice that to, ge, or go, both of those words are dative singular. They have an omega ending with an iota subscript.
Right.
So that kind of sentence, that's what I was going after by introducing the word didomi, being able to make that kind of sentence with a subject, verb, direct object, and then an indirect object that's receiving whatever it is that's being given. So this kind of sentence is great practice for our readers because they're learning how to see the accusative case and the dative case working together.
Right. And one of the nice things about the dative case is that the iota subscript is a very common feature of the dative singular. And so when we see the iota subscript with nouns, a lot of times that's a signal of, hi, I'm dative, as if that little iota is just very loud.
We had a big, long discussion of this a few lessons ago, right?
Mm-hmm.
We talked about a little bit of the history of Greek writing and how the iota subscript got to be there in the first place. But you're correct, Catherine. For our current purposes, seeing that iota subscript at the most basic level, it does signal that that is dative singular in this declension that we're working with. So our next example sentence is very similar to the first one, except it's got ego. Ego didomi, I give. And then we're giving the pen to the philosopher. So that's a similar sentence. But then we have something a little different in the next one, the one that starts with arton. Why don't you take us through that one, Catherine, and tell us what's different there?
Well, first of all, the word order is different because instead of starting with the verb or with the subject, we're starting with the direct object, arton, and then proceeding from there. Arton didomi, and that, of course, is our new verb, I give. And then the indirect object is right after the verb, to huyo, to the sun. And then we have a new element. We have this genitive, to georgu, that is further describing the to huyo. Whose son? The son of the farmer, or the farmer's son. And so this is a good way for our listeners to see just how there can be a lot of different elements in one sentence. They're getting to the point where we're able to add more elements than just one in one sentence and make it more like you would see in a text.
One of my old Latin teachers used to say that in Latin, the thing that really tells the story is noun endings.
Mm-hmm.
He said, verbs aren't really all that big a deal. He says the thing that really communicates meaning in Latin is noun endings. That's where the words really express things. And over the years, I've gotten to the point where I really think that's true, especially in poetry.
Yeah.
Those nouns and their noun endings, they work really hard in poetry to express a lot of meaning. And I think that's true in Greek too. Here we have didomi. We know that, I am giving something. But look at what else is here. Accusative, dative, and genitive. Without those noun endings, we would have no idea what's happening in the sentence.
Right.
So the nouns and their noun endings, they are really telling the story here, and you have to pay attention to the noun endings if you really want to know what a sentence is expressing in ancient Greek. And that's why I devote so much of this book to teaching the 5 basic noun cases.
Those will serve the listeners very well later.
And so, Catherine, as another example of how nouns and noun endings really tell the story, this last example sentence points that out. Here we have the dative case first, that is the indirect object comes first with to imporo. Then we have the direct object, then the verb is at the end. So you absolutely cannot depend on word order to tell you anything in a sentence like this.
Right.
You just absolutely have to look carefully at the noun endings and figure out what cases they are.
Definitely.
So here we have, I am giving silver to the merchant. As you look at this sentence, you have to take note that that first noun there, imporo, that's the indirect object. So to the merchant or for the merchant, arguron, that's accusative, so you know it's the direct object. Silver, I am giving. So it's basically the reverse of English word order. Instead of saying, I am giving silver to the merchant, it's to the merchant, silver, I am giving.
Yeah. And it's perfectly possible for our listeners to find a sentence like this in Greek texts as they get more advanced. So this is not unheard of as a sentence structure. And so just, again, we keep harping on this, but early paying attention to noun endings pays off later when an author decides to rearrange his sentence for dramatic effect.
And that's a great point, Catherine, because whoever is writing the text, the writer might want to tell you who's receiving the thing first.
Mm-hmm.
The writer might want to tell you what the thing is that's being given first. Or it might want to tell you who's giving the thing. Just depending on the style and the feeling of the text, any number of word orders could be appropriate, depending on what the writer wants to express.
Exactly.
Greek is very flexible like that. So long story short is you have to look at the noun endings to see what the nouns are doing. You just cannot depend on word order.